When was the last time you looked in the mirror of your soul and said, "I can't go on like this anymore"? What would happen if you allowed an inner spring to blossom, even in the midst of life's chaos? Do you believe in the power of starting over, even when everything around you seems to crumble like dry leaves in autumn? It was a cold July morning. The small apartment's half-open window let in a dull light, filtered by the low clouds that covered the city like a gray blanket. Mateus woke without any enthusiasm, the alarm clock echoing like a funeral bell, announcing another day like any other. He stood up slowly, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He walked to the window and looked out gray buildings, traffic already forming endless lines, people walking hurriedly, heads bowed, as if carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. In the reflection of the glass, he saw his own face, dark circles, a hollow expression. A 34-year-old man who looked 60. It was as if an essential part of him was slowly dying, day by day. But something inside him refused to accept that static life. A tiny, almost imperceptible spark still pulsed somewhere deep within him. And it would be that spark that would change everything. This is the story of how Matthew opened himself to a new life and how, in the process, he discovered that the same universal forces that make trees blossom in spring also dwell within each of us. Mateus lived trapped in a routine that suffocated him like an invisible straitjacket. Every morning, the same ritual, rising at 7:30, bitter coffee, quick shower, wrinkled clothes, rush to the bus stop. Work was an endless succession of spreadsheets, purposeless meetings, and a boss who screamed about impossible goals. He'd graduated in architecture, dreaming of building spaces that inspired people. But now he spent his days calculating the square footage of identical apartments, small cubes, where other people would also live their stagnant lives. Finances were always tight, his credit card maxed out, his dreams were stored in a dusty drawer, like old projects he never looked at again. There were days when he wondered, where did that young man who believed he could change the world go? His relationships were as fragile as cracked porcelain. Friends only showed up to complain about life, girlfriends who disappeared when they realized he was emotionally absent. His own family looked at him with that pitying look that said, "Mateus could have been so much, ... Single quotes every morning he woke with a weight on his chest, as if a stone had grown there overnight. Again, he sighed, looking up at the peeling ceiling of his room. He felt like he was walking, and walking, but always in the same place. It was like being on a conveyor belt moving in the opposite direction. The harder you pushed, the further you fell behind. The anguish manifested itself in silent ways, staring blankly into traffic, late nights staring at cell phones. Mental fatigue that wouldn't go away even with entire weekends of sleep. Questions hammered at her mind. Is this it? Is this all life has to offer? It was on a random Tuesday, during lunchtime, that everything began to change. Mateus had left the office with a headache and decided to walk to the nearby park in search of a few minutes of peace. There, among children playing and people walking their dogs, stood an ancient tree. It was an IPA that must have been decades old. Its branches were dry, its bark scarred by time and storms. At first glance, it appeared dead. But when Matthew looked more closely, he saw small green shoots sprouting directly from the trunk, new life blossoming from apparent death. The tree hadn't given up. Even wounded, even scarred, it continued to fight to blossom. He sat on the bench in front of the tree and, for the first time in years, he cried. He cried for everything he had lost, for all the dreams postponed, for all the life he was wasting. But he also cried with relief because he had finally understood something fundamental. If that tree struggles to stand and still manages to sprout new shoots, why don't I struggle to blossom? That moment's simple, silent, yet profoundly revealing planted the first seed of change in her parched soul. The next morning, Matthew woke with a different feeling. It wasn't euphoria, nor unbridled optimism. It was something more subtle, like a cool breeze coming through the window of a stuffy room. He decided to start with something small, almost insignificant, waking up an hour earlier to walk. If I start small, he thought, maybe I can sustain the change. The first day was difficult. When the alarm clock rang at 6:38 a.m., his body screamed in protest. Just 5 more minutes, he bargained with himself. But he managed to get up. He put on a jacket and walked out into the still empty street. The morning walk revealed a completely different city. The same buildings, the same streets, but with a quality of golden light he'd never noticed before. Birds sang, doormen scrubbed sidewalks, bakers opened their shops, wafting the aroma of fresh bread. How could I have missed this all these years, he asked himself. In addition to walking, he decided to read 15 minutes a day before bed, not depressing news or social media, but books that nourished his soul. He started with a book on Eastern philosophy he found in a used bookstore, but the mind, accustomed to old patterns, began to react. The inner voices grew louder. Do you think a walk will solve your life? You've tried to change before and always given up. Why fool yourself? You're just like that. Your colleagues will think you've lost your mind. The first week, he managed to maintain his routine. The second, the excuses began. It was raining, so he couldn't walk. He'd gotten home late from work, so he couldn't read. He was so tired. Little by little, old habits began to creep back in. He started waking up at the last minute again, spending hours scrolling through his phone before bed. It was one rainy August morning that something changed forever. Mateus woke to the sound of rain pounding against the window. His first reaction was to turn off the alarm and go back to sleep after all. It was impossible to walk in the rain. But just as he was about to fall asleep again, he heard an inner voice different from the other, softer, truer. What if the storm outside is just a reflection of the storm inside? Without fully understanding what was motivating him, he got up, put on a raincoat that had been forgotten in the closet, and left. Walking in the rain was a transformative experience. The streets were deserted, the air was clear, the city noise muffled by the sound of raindrops. He felt alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. In the park, even with the rain, he saw a familiar figure, a white-haired man, perhaps about 70 years old, feeding birds under a large tree that served as a natural shelter. The man looked up and, seeing Matthew, smiled warmly. "Good morning, young man. What a beautiful morning to be alive, don't you think?" Matthew was surprised. Beautiful morning. It was raining, cold, and the sky was gray. "Excuse me?" he replied, "but do you think this morning is beautiful?" The old man scattered some more seeds on the ground and replied unhurriedly, "My son, have you ever noticed that it is precisely in the rain that plants grow, that it is storms that clean the air, that it is after darkness that dawn always comes?" He paused, looking directly into Matthew's eyes. "May your day blossom, young man. And remember, every morning is a new chance to plant something beautiful." That seemingly chance encounter planted a powerful seed in Mateus's heart. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone on his journey. Motivated by his encounter with the park owner, Mateus decided to intensify his efforts to change. Beyond his morning walk and evening reading, he began planning bigger changes, perhaps taking up drawing again, finding a better job, or taking better care of his health. But as he progressed, the internal crises became more intense. It was as if a part of him was fighting desperately to keep him in the familiar place, even if it was a place of suffering. During morning walks, sabotaging thoughts would creep in out of nowhere. "You're already 34. It's too late to change. People like you can't make real changes. Remember that time you tried to learn guitar and gave up? What about English? What about the gym? You always give up." At work, when I scribbled little architectural plans during my breaks, I heard the cruel voice of self-criticism. "What a pathetic architect you've become. Your college friends must be laughing at you at night." When I picked up the book to read, my mind would race. Why waste time on these philosophies? It won't pay your bills. It won't solve your real problems. There were weeks when Matthew made real progress. He woke up consistently early, felt more energetic, had creative ideas, and even talked to a coworker he'd been wanting to talk to for months. But then the relapses came. I'd sleep in late, spend entire weekends on the couch watching TV shows, drink too much on a Friday, and waste the entire Saturday hungover. In those moments, the guilt was overwhelming. He would look in the mirror and see the same empty face as before. "I knew it," he would mutter to himself. "I knew I couldn't do it." One September night, Mateus was going through a particularly intense crisis. Sitting in the dark of his room, he flipped through old photos on his cell phone. There he was, 25, graduating from college, with a radiant smile, eyes full of hope. Beside him, his proud parents. "What happened to me?" he whispered into the void. He called some old friends. 2 calls went to voicemail. A third answered, but he was at a party, music blaring in the background, and he could barely talk. He called his mother, but he didn't know what to say. How could he explain that he was lost in his own life? How could he confess that, at 34, he felt more lost than he had at 18? "Is everything okay, son?" she asked, noticing something strange in his voice. "Yes, Mom. I just wanted to hear your voice." But nothing was right. The crisis reached its peak on a Friday in October. Mateus received an email from the company announcing a restructuring. He wouldn't be fired, but his role would be reallocated, a euphemism for saying he'd be doing even more mechanical work for practically the same salary. That night, he got drunk alone in his apartment. He woke up Saturday on the couch, naked, with a headache and a bitter taste in his mouth that wasn't just from the alcohol. He stood there, motionless, for hours. He didn't shower, he didn't eat properly, he didn't answer the phone. He just stared at the ceiling and asked himself, why am I wasting my time with this whole new beginning thing? Why don't I just accept that I'm just like this? Maybe it's better to give up on this illusion of change altogether. It was his darkest moment, rock bottom. But, as he would soon discover, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to make the leap. On Sunday morning, still emotionally hungover, Mateus was forced to go out to buy food. There was nothing in the apartment except an expired yogurt. Walking through the neighborhood streets, he passed by the park again, where he had seen the tree that had inspired him months before. He decided to approach it. The tree was completely transformed. It was spring, and what had once seemed dead now burst into vibrant yellow blossoms. The IPA was glorious, majestic, radiating life and color. Matthew sat on the same bench as before and had a profound realization. The tree did not blossom because it did not experience hardship. It blossomed because it experienced it. The winter, the drought, the storms, all of this was necessary for the blossoms we see today to be possible for the first time. He understood that his problems, his crises, his falls were not impediments to transformation. They were an essential part of it. It was on a Monday, still feeling the echoes of that revelation under the flowering IPA tree, that Mateus decided to do something different at lunchtime. Instead of eating a sandwich at the office, he went out to explore a street he'd never fully explored. It was an old street with colonial houses mixed with more modern buildings. There was a small bookstore with a worn facade that looked like it had been there for decades. In the dusty window, books were stacked haphazardly, some with covers faded by the sun. Livraria do Tempo, read a loose wooden sign. Without knowing exactly why, Matthew pushed the door open. A little bell announced his entrance. The place was larger inside than it appeared. Tall shelves reached the ceiling, books arranged in sections that seemed to follow their own logic. There was a pleasant smell of old paper and wood, mixed with a subtle sandalwood incense. At the back of the store, a man of about 50 with gray hair tied back in a ponytail was reading intently behind a counter covered in open books. "Good afternoon," said Matthew, a little embarrassed. The man looked up. They were kind eyes, which seemed to hold many stories. "Good afternoon. Are you looking for something specific, or do you want to let books find you?" The question was strange, but somehow it made sense. "I think, I want to let myself be found." The bookseller smiled. "Then walk? Books have a way of calling to those who need them." Mateus browsed the shelves leisurely. There were sections on literature, philosophy, spirituality, and biographies. On a lower shelf, something caught his eye, a thin book with a plain cover, half hidden among larger volumes. The Inner Garden Reflections on Transformation and Rebirth by an author he had never heard of. He opened it to a random page and read, "You carry within you the same forces that make the planets spin, the tides rise and fall, the seasons alternate. The life that pulses throughout the universe also pulses within you. It's not a matter of believing it or not, it's a matter of allowing it." Matthew's heart raced. It was exactly what he needed to hear. Continued reading, "All real transformation begins when we stop fighting what we are and begin collaborating with what we can become. The butterfly does not fight the caterpillar, it honors it as a necessary part of the process." Matthew took the book to the counter. The bookseller looked at the cover and smiled knowingly. "Ah, you met Roberto Man, a wise man I knew personally many years ago. Did you know the author?" "I knew him. Roberto was an architect, you know." "Just like you." Matthew was surprised. "How do you know I'm an architect?" The man pointed to the folder Mateus was carrying, with some projects peeking out from the opening. Roberto also went through a profound crisis in his 30s. He was lost, aimless, and felt he had lost his purpose. So he decided to travel to India. And what happened there? He told me he didn't find answers in the mountains or in the temples. The answers were inside him all along. The trip just helped him shut out the internal noise so he could hear them. The bookseller paused, shuffling some papers. Roberto returned, transformed. He didn't abandon architecture, in fact, he became an extraordinary architect. But he began designing not just buildings, but spaces that touch people's souls. He used to say that true architecture is about creating environments where people can flourish. Mateus took out his wallet to pay for the book, but the bookseller made a gesture of refusal. "This first one is on the house. Roberto always said that certain seeds need to be planted for free to germinate in the right soil." He took a sheet of paper and wrote something down. "If you want to dig deeper, here's the address for a group that meets bi-weekly. People who are on similar journeys to yours." Roberto used to participate before he left. He died 5 years ago. But he left a beautiful legacy. And, in a way, he continues to help people through the books and the seeds he planted. Mateus left the bookstore in a state of positive shock. How is this possible? What forces had conspired to allow him to find exactly what he needed at exactly the right moment? For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone on his journey. It was as if the universe had whispered, "I see you struggling, and I'm here to help." That night, Mateus read The Inner Garden in one sitting. Every page seemed to have been written especially for him. Roberto Meneses described with surgical precision exactly what he was, experiencing the feeling of being trapped in a life that didn't belong to him, the paralyzing fear of change, the internal resistance that sabotaged every attempt at growth. But the book didn't just describe problems, it offered a map, a path, a practical philosophy of transformation based on observing nature. The same laws that govern universal renewal, Roberto wrote, also operate within each human being. Just as the seasons alternate, we have our periods of autumn letting die what no longer serves, winter withdrawal and preparation, spring rebirth and new growth, and summer blossoming in abundance. Matthew realized that he had spent years trapped in an eternal autumn, not allowing the winter necessary to prepare for spring to arrive. The mistake, the text continued, is trying to force spring without going through winter. It's wanting flowers without accepting that some leaves need to fall first. Over the next few days, Matthew began to notice strange things, or perhaps he was paying attention for the first time. On Tuesday, walking to work, he heard a song playing through an open window. The lyrics spoke of new beginnings and second chances. It was a song he must have heard 1,000 times, but only now did the words make sense. On Wednesday, in the office elevator, a colleague casually remarked, "You seem different, Matthew." More ... present. He hadn't told anyone about his changes. On Thursday, he passed by the construction site of a building being constructed near his office. The architect in charge was there, supervising. He was a man in his 40s, and Matthew listened as he told the workers, "Remember, we're not just building a building, we're creating a home for people we don't even know yet. Every detail matters." Synchronicities abounded. Books on personal growth appeared in the most unexpected places. Random conversations touched on exactly what he was reflecting on. It was as if the whole world had become a great teacher. Inspired by the teachings of Roberto Meneses, Mateus developed the habit of observing nature with new eyes. During his morning walks, he would stop to truly appreciate the trees, the flowers, the birds. He noticed a rhythm, a pulse, in natural life that he had never perceived before. Plants didn't force their growth, they simply grew, at the right time, in the right way. Birds didn't strain to sing, the song came naturally to them. What if, he thought, I could trust my own natural rhythm of transformation? He began carrying a small notebook where he jotted down thoughts, reflections, and phrases that touched him. It wasn't a formal diary, more like a record of awakenings. Some notes from those days. The tree is in no hurry. It knows its time will come. Maybe I'm not late in life. Maybe I'm just arriving in my own time. Resisting change is like trying to stop the tide with your hands. Better to learn to surf. Every ending is also a beginning in disguise. One Saturday morning, Matthew decided to do something he'd never tried before. Sit under a tree in the park and simply ... be. Not read, not plan, not think, just be present. He chose a centuries-old silk cotton tree with a wide trunk and generous crown. He sat against the trunk and closed his eyes. At first, his mind raced, to-do lists, worries, plans, but gradually, the internal noise subsided. He began to hear the sounds of the park, children playing in the distance, wind in the leaves, birds chattering. When he opened his eyes 40 minutes later, he felt different, calmer, more centered, as if he had reconnected with some deep part of himself he had forgotten existed. During those weeks, Mateus delved deeper into ideas about personal transformation. He read about the concept of death and rebirth present in various spiritual and philosophical traditions. He understood that it was not a literal death, but the death of limiting identities, beliefs that no longer served him, patterns of behavior that imprisoned him, to be born again. He wrote in his notebook, "I must have the courage to die to who I was. And that hurts, but it is the pain of birth, not of destruction." He began to see his previous crises with new eyes. They weren't failures, they were attempts by a new version of himself to emerge, like a baby bird trying to break out of an egg. Matthew realized he had tried to live in a forced spring, denying his moments of autumn and winter, but the internal seasons are as natural as the external ones. There were times to plant inner spring, to grow and blossom inner summer, to harvest and give thanks inner autumn, and to gather and prepare inner winter. Perhaps, he reflected, I am finally allowing my inner spring to arrive naturally. After so long fighting my own winter, Mateus's internal transformation began to spill over into the external world in ways he hadn't planned. It was as if, by connecting with his truest essence, he naturally began to radiate a different energy. One November morning, during his usual walk, Mateus encountered Donna Rosa, a woman in her 70s who was constantly trying to tend a small garden in front of her ground-floor apartment. She was clearly struggling with a heavy bag of composted soil. Without thinking twice, he approached. "Can I help you with that, Mrs. Rosa?" She gratefully accepted, as she helped carry the bags and plant some seedlings. Donna Rosa commented, "It's been so long since anyone offered me such spontaneous help. Most people just rush past, each focused on their own problems." "Actually," Matthew replied, "I think that by helping you, I'm helping myself too. I feel useful in a way I haven't felt in a long time." Donna Rosa smiled with that wisdom that only the elderly possess. "That's true, my son. When we give, we receive. It's a law of life that never fails." At work, Mateus noticed that a new intern, Daniel, was struggling with some design programs he was proficient in. Instead of just doing his own work, he began setting aside a few minutes each day to teach the young man. Daniel was receptive and eager to learn. Mateus rediscovered something he'd forgotten. He had a knack for teaching. He could explain complex concepts simply, was patient, and knew how to motivate. Professor Mateus, Daniel joked, "You should teach." The phrase planted a seed. Mateus began to imagine what it would be like to teach architecture differently, not just the technical aspects, but the philosophy behind creating spaces that elevate the human spirit. Through the study group that the bookseller had recommended, and which Mateus finally decided to attend, he met Marina, a social worker who worked at a public housing NGO. Marina commented on a challenge they were facing. They had secured funding to build simple homes for needy families, but the city's standard architectural design was cold, impersonal, and soulless. "We need an architect who understands that we're not just building houses," she said. "We're building homes, places where people will raise their children, make memories, and start their lives over." Mateus felt his heart race. It was exactly the kind of project he'd always dreamed of doing. "I'd like to help," he said, almost in disbelief. "I can do it as a volunteer." Marina was surprised. "Really? But it would be a big, complex project. ... Single quotes, exactly for that reason," Mateus replied. "I haven't felt truly challenged in a long time, and I think this project can teach me as much as I can contribute." What began as a few hours of volunteering on Saturdays became the most energizing part of Mateus's week. He visited the land where the houses would be built, spoke with the families, and understood their specific needs. Donna Maria, a single mother of 3, dreamed of a small corner for medicinal plants. Su Joe, retired, wanted a small workshop where he could repair neighborhood bicycles. The Santos family needed a space that would accommodate their wheelchair-bound grandfather with dignity. Mateus discovered that true architecture is not about impressing with bold forms, but about honoring the human stories that will inhabit the spaces. Working on the volunteer project, Mateus rediscovered skills he never knew he possessed. He had a knack for coordinating teams, finding creative solutions on limited budgets, and listening skills that made people feel truly understood. Mateus Marina said one afternoon, "You have a special sensitivity to this. Have you ever thought about specializing in social housing?" The question made him reflect. Perhaps his true calling wasn't to design corporate skyscrapers, but to create spaces where ordinary people could live with dignity and beauty. One of the side projects that emerged from the Houses Initiative was a community garden on the vacant lot next door. Mateus suggested that, while they awaited bureaucratic approvals for the construction, they could use the space to grow crops. What began as a practical idea became a beautiful social experiment. Families who barely knew each other began working together, children learned about plants, and seniors shared cultivation knowledge. Mateus met there every Saturday morning, often until sunset. Not because he had to, but because he felt genuinely nourished by the experience. One thing that started to stand out was how people reacted differently to Mateus. At work, colleagues commented that he seemed more present. At the neighborhood bakery, the owner always greeted him with a special smile. Even his mother, on the phone, said, "Son, I don't know what you've been doing, but your voice is different. More ... Alive, Mateus realized that when we connect with our true purpose, it is automatically reflected in our energy, our posture, and the sparkle in our eyes. In a conversation with the study group, Mateus shared an important discovery. "I always thought that I needed to completely fix myself first before I could contribute to the world. But I discovered that it's the opposite. It's by serving that we heal, it's by contributing that we grow." One of the participants, a psychologist named Roberto, confirmed, "That's exactly it. When we focus only on our own problems, they tend to grow. But when we direct our attention to how we can be of service, our problems find perspective and often resolve themselves naturally. One of the most surprising things for Mateus was discovering that the more time and energy he dedicated to volunteering, the more energy he had for everything else in life. It was as if the act of service generated more internal resources than it consumed. His mornings had become more productive, his nights more peaceful, his relationships more fluid. It was as if, by aligning his actions with his deepest values, he had unlocked a source of energy he hadn't known existed. 6 months after that first encounter with the tree in the park, Matthew woke up one spring morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Spontaneous gratitude, not forced or intellectual gratitude, but a genuine sense of appreciation for life itself, including its imperfections, its challenges, its uncertainties. Mateus had learned something fundamental. Transformation is not a destination, it is an ongoing process. Just as trees don't arrive in spring and remain in bloom forever, human beings also go through constant cycles. There were days when he woke up discouraged, weeks when old fears whispered again, moments when he questioned whether he was truly changing or just deluding himself. But now, instead of interpreting these fluctuations as failures, he saw them as natural parts of the process. "I'm in my inner winter," he would tell himself on the hardest days, "and that's okay. Spring always comes back." One of his greatest achievements was to stop comparing himself to others or external timelines. Mateus developed a deep confidence in his own growth rate. When people in his study group commented on the rapid progress they were making, he no longer felt inadequate. When he saw people his age on social media who seemed more accomplished, he no longer devalued himself. "Every tree has its own time to bloom," he wrote in his notebook. "A sequoia can't be compared to an IP. Each has its own unique beauty and perfect timing." One December morning, walking down the same street where it all began, Mateus stopped in front of a shop window mirror and was startled. The man staring back at him had the same features, but something fundamental had changed. His eyes were bright. His posture was more erect. There was a lightness in his face he hadn't seen in years. "When did this happen?" he asked himself, smiling. The transformation had been so gradual, so organic, that he had barely noticed. It was like watching a plant grow day by day. You don't notice a difference, but every now and then you realize a profound shift has occurred. That afternoon, he decided to walk through the park where it all began. To his delight, he found the man feeding the birds, the same man who had planted the first seed of hope months earlier. "Hello, young man," the old man greeted with the same warm smile. "How is the inner spring going?" Matthew was surprised. How did he remember? "It's blossoming little by little," he replied, smiling. "Do you remember me?" "Of course I remember. You were walking in the rain that day, but I could see that inside it was much stormier than outside." They paused contemplatively, watching the birds. "And now?" the man asked. Now, it still rains sometimes, but I've learned to dance in the rain instead of just getting wet." The old man laughed, satisfied. "You know, young man, I've been feeding these birds for 15 years. And one thing I've learned from observing nature is that it never gives up. A seed can lie dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions. But when the time comes, it always sprouts." On the last day of the year, Mateus decided to take a special walk. He woke before sunrise and went to a viewpoint in the city from which he could see the horizon. He walked through the still deserted streets, stepping on dew-damp leaves. The air was fresh, clean, full of possibilities. The first birds were beginning to sing. He arrived at the lookout just as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon. The city was slowly waking up, a few windows lighting up, the traffic still timid, life returning to its rhythm. Sitting on a bench at the gazebo, Mateus looked back not physically, but at the man he had been months ago. That lost, hopeless Mateus, trapped in a life that didn't belong to him. He felt compassion for that earlier version of himself. Not judgment or criticism, but genuine tenderness. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, "for holding on, for not giving up completely, for keeping alive that tiny spark that made all of this possible." Then he looked ahead to the literal and metaphorical horizon. There was so much to discover, so much to grow, so much to contribute. But now, instead of anxiety, he felt curiosity. Instead of fear of the future, he felt confidence in the process. Mateus took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. It was as if he were breathing, not just oxygen, but possibilities, hope, new life. He remembered a phrase he had read in Roberto Meneses: "Every breath is a new chance. Every dawn is a new birth. Every present moment is an opportunity to choose who we want to be." On the way back, Mateus watched the city awaken. People leaving for work, children going to school, elderly people walking in the parks. Each carried their own story, their own struggles, their own seeds of transformation. He felt connected to all of humanity, walking the walk, all searching for something: happiness, purpose, peace, growth, all with infinite potential, even if they couldn't always see it. We are all gardeners, he thought, tending to each other's inner gardens, sometimes without even knowing it. Single quotes. When he got home, Matthew didn't make any New Year's resolutions. He didn't set any grandiose goals or detailed plans. He simply sat at the same window where it all began, looked out at the awakening city, and felt a silent certainty. I don't know exactly where this journey will take me, but I trust the process. I trust the seasons within. I trust that the same forces that make trees blossom also operate within me. It was a confidence different from arrogance or delusion. It was the confidence of someone who had learned to cooperate with universal laws rather than fight against them. Matthew's story is our own story. It is the universal journey of every human being who refuses to accept a life less than the one for which they were created. He opened himself to change when he finally understood that resistance to transformation is more painful than the transformation itself. He allowed inner mornings to blossom when he stopped fighting his own seasons. He trusted his potential when he understood that the same power that moves the planets also pulses within him. He learned to serve because he discovered that we are all part of the same fabric of life, and that by lifting others, we lift ourselves up as well. He walked with patience because he understood that true growth doesn't happen in a straight line, but in upward spirals. Each of us carries within us a Matthew, that part that yearns for expansion, that refuses to accept mediocrity, that whispers in the quiet moments, "You can be more. You can contribute more. You can flourish." The same laws that regulate universal renewal are also within you. The force that makes the seed break the earth, that propels the tree toward the light, that guides migratory birds, this force also dwells in your heart. But universal laws require our conscious cooperation. A tree doesn't resist the wind, it dances with it. Water doesn't fight against stone, it finds a way around it. Spring doesn't arrive violently, it emerges gently, day after day. We must participate in the march of life, not as forced soldiers, but as dancers who have found the rhythm of universal music. The final invitation, and now we come to the end of this journey, but perhaps the beginning of yours and you. Are you willing to break through the shell of the old to be born again? Are you willing to honor your inner seasons, including the necessary winters that precede every spring? What kind of spring sleeps within you, waiting only for your permission to bloom? What unique gifts do you carry that the world is waiting to receive? If that time-beaten tree can still produce vibrant flowers, if Matthew can transform his life at 34, if ordinary people can become gardens of possibilities, why can't you? When will you take the first step toward your new life? When will you stop waiting for perfect conditions and start working with the conditions you have? What will be your next inner spring morning? Allow yourself a moment of silence. Listen to your breathing, feel your heart beating. Notice that, at this very moment, millions of renewal processes are taking place in your body, cells renewing, blood circulating, life pulsating. You are already a miracle of constant transformation. Now it's time to make this transformation conscious, intentional, and loving. Universal forces don't shout, they whisper. They don't force, they invite. And right now, they are whispering to you, it's time. Your inner spring is ready to begin. The only question that remains is, are you ready to say yes?